Good morning, everybody. I had to unmute myself. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining today's web conference on the Department of Market Monitoring's report on EIM resource sufficiency evaluation in the EIM for July and August, which was published last Friday, September 23rd, 2021. We're hoping very much today that this will be a conversation. If you would like to ask a question or bring up a question during today's call, please use the raise hand feature in WebEx. You may also enter a comment in the chat. Please remember to state your name and affiliation before asking your question, whether that is verbally or with the chat. We will stop for questions throughout the presentation. The report and other materials can be found using the links in the presentation. Calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meeting. The recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meeting. The recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And with that, I will turn the presentation today over to Eric. And Eric, a reminder to unmute yourself in WebEx. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, this is Eric, and can everybody hear me? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. This is Eric Hildebrandt. I'm the Executive Director of the Department of Market Monitoring, and I'm just going to give a brief introduction and then turn it over to Kyle Westendorf, who's our primary staff member on all things doing with analysis and reporting on the sufficiency tests. But just by way of introduction, DMM kind of at the request of and in consultation with the ISO, the governing body, and some EIM stakeholders, we have agreed to play an expanded role in monitoring and reporting on the resource sufficiency test performance and kind of the market design issues being considered as we speak. So we've always covered this in our quarterly reports and actually done quite a bit of reporting on the sufficiency tests in the past, but so we're going to increase that and do special monthly reporting. We began in September, so this was our first report that we're getting out. We'll continue to do that on a monthly basis. And so the aim here is to provide quicker feedback on performance and additional metrics. As Kyle will go over, this report, we just wanted to get out all the metrics that we had developed, get feedback on those, and then work on some expanded metrics and then actual analysis, of the metrics and some of the data. So we will have some additional information in quarterly reports, but most of this may actually go in the monthly because there's a much quicker or shorter lag. But we do have a forthcoming Q2 report that will have some additional analysis that we didn't put in this monthly report. And that Q2 report will be out, I think, next week or this week. So we, again, are going to plan on working with stakeholders and the ISO on the development of some additional reporting metrics and analysis. So kind of the goals here are to make standardized metrics for all the balancing areas and the California ISO. I think most of these metrics are kind of at a balancing area level. We would like to provide detailed underlying data to participants, and we're ready to provide all the, for instance, all the data that you see in all of the charts we present today. We're able to provide that on an interval basis to participants. But one issue, I know we're posing the question to the ISO, and we will we'll be able to release whatever is agreed to by the ISO and stakeholders. Our understanding is some balancing areas would prefer that their data not be released to the whole market, and so I think that issue is still under some discussion. But I think all the data we have that we would release, it's not on a resource level data. It is aggregated up to a balancing area data. So I know traditionally in the California ISO, we do publish a lot of aggregated balancing data if it's aggregated up to the balancing area. So this would be consistent with past practice would be to release stuff on a balancing area basis to everybody and make it available. So again, today is the first crack at some metrics. I think Kyle's has some more in the pipeline that he's going to preview today. And then, as I said, once, our goal is to get data out to participants as soon as possible so they can start looking at it. And then we'll engage more in some actual analysis or more analysis of the data ourselves. And we in particular are going to focus on some analysis that would quantify the potential implications or impacts or magnitude of some of the design changes being discussed in both how the requirement is calculated and how the available supply is calculated. So we realize that's an important information that the stakeholders would like as they consider the design changes. So that's the next thing we're going to turn to and try to get that out so that that can be used in the stakeholder process. And then finally, we are going to do enhanced informational reporting to the governing body. I forget if that's on a quarterly basis or perhaps every meeting they have, but we are going to, then we'll start reporting out to the governing body, and that will, probably be more of a summary of the monthly data that we've been providing to participants as we go along. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kyle, and he will run through the rest of his presentation.
Hi, thank you, Eric. This is Kyle Westendorf. I'm an analyst with the Department of Market Monitoring. So like Eric said, as the first report, the goal of the presentation today is mostly to provide an overview of the existing metrics. I'll also touch on some of the metrics we're developing. But I want to reiterate that throughout the presentation, if there are any questions or feedback or additional metrics that would make the report more beneficial for you, we'd be happy to hear that. And with that, let me jump into the metrics. So the report focuses on the flexible ramping sufficiency test and the bid range capacity test. These are two of the tests in the EIM resource sufficiency evaluation. Failing either of these two tests will cap EIM transfers. So on the screen here, it's our standard metric covering the frequency of upward flexible ramping sufficiency test failures by month and EIM entity. So you can get a sense for each month and area, the percent of 15-minute test intervals in which we see a failure. So this is upward flexible ramping sufficiency test. And then if we go to the next slide, this is a new addition in the report, which complements the previous chart. It's looking at the average shortfall of those flex ramp sufficiency test failures. So you can combine the two and see how often these are occurring and how large that magnitude is. All right, so for the next set of slides, we have a lot of slides to cover, so I think we can skip over them. It's just looking at the upward and downward direction, the same metrics, bid range capacity test and flexible ramping sufficiency test. All right, so here, this is looking at the capacity and flexible ramping sufficiency tests together. I have a few charts in this format, so I want to walk through it. The black horizontal lines correspond to the right axis and show the number of failure intervals. And then you have the BAAs sorted in descending number of failure intervals. And then you can look at the bars and see of those failure intervals, was it the capacity test only failed, the flex ramp sufficiency test, or both tests failing concurrently? So from this, you can see for each area in this July-August period, which test or both is driving those failure intervals, which are capping EIM transfers. And then you can also see in the metric that there's quite a bit of variety across the EIM areas. And then if we move to the next slide here, it's exactly the same, except for we're now looking at the downward direction. I'll just note here that I'm only showing EIM entities with a failure interval in the downward direction, which excludes quite a few areas for that July-August period. And then I just want to get through one last set of metrics before I jump to the first pause break for questions. This is looking at additional capacity test failures with this new uncertainty component. On June 16th, the ISO added a uncertainty component to the bid range capacity test. This is similar to what was already in place for the flexible ramping sufficiency test. What we're showing here by month and area are actual failure intervals that would have passed without that additional uncertainty component. And going to this next slide, it's the same idea, but we are excluding the intervals in which the flexible ramping sufficiency test also failed. So since the outcome of failing the flexible ramping sufficiency test is the same as the capacity test, this metric captures additional intervals in which EIM transfers were capped with that uncertainty component. And with that, I think we can pause, see if there's any questions. Maybe we can do a reminder for how to enter questions either through the chat or through the line.
So as a reminder, you can either enter questions in the chat or you can use the raise hand feature in WebEx, and I do believe we can take questions that way. While we're giving people a chance to bring up any questions they may have on these metrics, I'll address a discussion that's being had in the chat. There was a request to post the slides. I want to reassure you the content in the slides today is all present in the report, which was published on Friday. But because there's interest going forward, we will post the presentation as well. Thanks. And with that, I saw a raised hand from, I'll leave it to the operator to let those who've raised their hand enter the queue. I don't know. Thank you.
Yep, there was a raised hand, but it looks like it was lowered. So just a reminder, you can use the raised hand icon. It's in the lower right, the participants panel, to enter the question queue, or you can type your question into the chat, and please send to all panelists. Looks like we do have a question from Dan Williams.
It's been addressed.
Okay.
Hi, Amelia. I actually have a different question, but I do appreciate you addressing the part about the slides. It just makes it easier to kind of prepare to know what to engage with. But the question that I had is one that I've had for a while with the reporting on resource efficiency metrics, and that's whether there's any way for the DMM to capture when these test failures are coincident with any sort of system emergency declaration, either for the CAISO or for the EIM areas. I think it'd be especially useful to see how these line up with in EEA 1 or 2, or in the extreme and in EEA 3, to tell whether the test failures are concurrent with having an actual shortfall from a system perspective that could be leading to a reliability issue. So that's just maybe a request for a future metric. I don't know how difficult that would be to capture, but it seems like it could be useful.
Thanks, Dan. We have a slide later in the presentation that shows just for the July 9th date and how these sufficiency failures line up with CAISO's EEA stage 2 emergency. But yeah, I agree we can look at doing a maybe more systematic approach covering the entire period. And with that, are there any other questions?
Okay, there are no more questions in the queue.
All right, so this next section is looking at the consequences of failing either test, and we're looking at the import limit which is imposed because of failing either test in the upper direction. So when either test fails in the upper direction, imports will be capped at the greater of the base transfer or the optimal transfer in the last 15-minute interval prior to the test. So if both the base transfer and the last 15-minute transfer are in a net export position, the cap will be imposed on the export side, meaning that they cannot export less than that level. So in this chart, it's similar to that format I showed earlier, looking at failure intervals, and it's summarizing the import limit that is imposed after failing the upward capacity or sufficiency test. So here, capped on the import side, that means that the area can still import energy through the energy imbalance market, but only to the extent of that limit. And to get a sense of how much that is, the next chart here is exactly the same, but we're quantifying that import limit by different amounts. So you can see just because there's an import limit in place, whether or not the area can still import 1,000 megawatts or 2,000 megawatts through the energy imbalance market. And then this next chart is really getting at whether the test failure mattered. So it's looking at the percent of failure intervals in which the resulting transfers are right up against the import limit that is imposed after failing the test. So we separate it out by both 15-minute transfers and 5-minute transfers, and whether it's right up against the import limit. One pattern we're keeping an eye on is the difference between the markets for the ISO. So for the ISO in this period, it was less than 25 failure intervals, which you can see by the black bar. But in those intervals, the imports were right up against the limit in more than 80% of 15-minute market intervals, but only around 10% of 5-minute market intervals. One driver of this is imbalance conformance adjustments. That can create a difference between the two markets. The next section kind of goes into summarizing the imbalance conformance adjustments, but I want to pause again and see if there's any questions on this section, because I know there was some interest in summarizing these import limits.
Again, as a reminder, you can use the raise hand feature to enter the question queue.
All right, and if any time, you can also ask questions later in the presentation for an earlier section. So the next section is just looking at imbalance conformance adjustments entered by operators. I bring this up, they're not considered directly as a component in either the flex ramp sufficiency test or the bid range capacity test, but we include them because they can impact test results indirectly. So the first reason is the flex ramp sufficiency test measures ramping capacity from the last 15-minute interval as the initial point. So here, imbalance conformance adjustments entered prior to the hour, it's effectively a change in load, which can impact internal generation at that initial reference point, which would then impact ramping capacity relative to that point. And then the second reason, failing either test will cap EIM transfers at the greater of the base transfer or the last 15-minute interval transfer. So you can imagine if there's a higher imbalance conformance adjustment effectively causing a higher load, that can increase EIM transfers coming into the area, which could increase the level at which transfers are potentially capped at following a failure. So here for the metrics, we're first summarizing average imbalance conformance adjustments, first starting with 15-minute adjustments made by the ISO. So it's our typical pattern that DMM has reported on in the past in our quarterly and annual market performance reports. So it's higher levels in the peak load hours and less so in the remaining hours. And then going to the next slide here, it's showing the EIM entities. This is just to give a sense of imbalance conformance activity kind of throughout the market. One note here is that we are excluding BEAs in this metric that without substantial imbalance conformance activity. All right, so the next section is a little different, talking about the balancing test. The balancing test, there isn't a market impact after failing the test, but there is a potential settlement penalty. So here, areas must show base schedules to be within 1% of the load forecast. Then after the fact, if there's a failure and if final metered load is 5% more or less than base schedules, there would be a penalty. And then just a note on what we're able to show. Because the penalty is very dependent on after the fact final metered demand, we are only able to show the most recent month with final data available. This is exacerbated by the new settlement timeline. So for here, we are only able to show April 2021 as the most recent month with final data available. In the chart, we are showing the total height of the bars are showing the initial underscheduling balancing test failures. And then within those bars, the categories show in the end how much the base schedules were underscheduled or overscheduled relative to final metered demand. And then going on to next metric, it's exactly the same except for we're looking at initial overscheduling balancing test failures and then what that final calculation looked like. And with that, let me pause again and see if there's any questions before I move to the next section.
Here we do have a question from Dan Williams. You're unmuted, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just a request for the future, if it's at all possible to do more of a box and whiskers representation of the imbalance conformance. It just, and if not for the entire period, it would at least be good to see some sample days just to see how the conformance trends looked on some of the higher demand days or on the tight system condition days, just to get a feel for how much the average is or how much movement there is around the average shape that's shown.
Yeah, we could look at doing that. I think the challenge would be doing something like that on an hourly level for each EIM entity, which could be 10 plus metrics, but we can definitely look at doing that, or maybe just the areas with substantial imbalance conformance activity.
Yeah, hey,
yeah,
this is Eric, and so this is a good example of, if we could produce interval level data to everybody, this is a good example because the averages, sometimes they're meaningful, but sometimes they're not. You want to see how, what was the range of values, on the most critical days and how much things were overlapping, which you can't tell from charts often. So I'll just mention, this is a case where it's hard for us to sum all that up in a few charts, and our preference would be to release the data at an interval level so everybody could see it for themselves.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I'm remembering back just to the price performance analysis from, that was 2019, I think, where the CAISO did produce some of that data, and you did see some outliers over peak periods that took the conformance up into, I think, the 3,000 megawatt range. So the deviation from the average was pretty substantial at times, and it was just kind of, it was good to see in that report just kind of how differently it can show up on different types of system conditions.
Yep, absolutely.
Anyway, thank you.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Dan.
There's a few other questions, I think, in the queue, Kyle.
Oh, let's go through that. Is that, operator, if we can open up the next line?
Okay, one moment. We've got Stuart Kelly. Please go ahead.
Hey, Kyle. Thank you. Yeah, I would like to get a little bit more information on what's, driving the load conformance. There's a multitude of things that could be causing that conformance. Obviously, I see some entities that do have a pattern, but I would like to maybe for next time start to dig into what's truly behind that. Is this some kind of persistent system issues, forecasting issues, or whatever that's actually causing it?
Yeah, that's helpful. One note on that is that there is almost like a drop-down box when entering these operator adjustments for a reason attached to them. We could summarize some of that data. The challenges with that is sometimes these reasons aren't perfectly in line with maybe the underlying cause just because of the stress of operating under kind of real-time conditions.
Understood, and I know that exists, but it would be good to start dissecting some of that data and see at least what reasons are getting attached when they're putting in the load biases. Because if there is some kind of persistent issue or persistent forecasting issue or whatever, we've got to go after that, because I always hear that this correlation between the load conformance and the tests, and I think the bigger issue in we need to get to the root cause of the issue. What's causing that, and try and fix the root cause, rather than look to the tests and maybe adjust tests to try and cure some form of load conformance. So I would really like to start to see that data.
Hey, Stuart, this is Eric again. On that one, I would add. So I think the causes in the ISO. So the ISO, California ISO, they have the most consistent pattern by far.
Mm-hmm.
And
mm-hmm.
we've made clear they're doing that to create ramp for the evening ramp. So I think we've been very clear, and over the years that pattern has become even more consistent. So I think it's very well understood what the ISO conformance is, but as Kyle shows, there isn't such a persistent pattern in the EIM areas, and the magnitude and frequency is a lot lower. So
right,
yeah.
And I understand that, Eric, and I can look at LAs, and I know there's some issues underlying and causing that. So I just don't want folks to be drawing the wrong conclusion. And yeah, if ISO is doing it for ramp, I guess, is that the correct thing to do? Right?
Yeah. So is your question apply to all BAs, or were you questioning more? Were you interested more in the EIM areas or the ISO, or just everything?
I'm looking at the ISO, and it's definitely pronounced, and that doesn't look quite right. But at the same time, I'm reflecting on the other entities, and it looks to me that some of what's driving that conformance is as much system issues, forecast errors, than anything, persistent than anything else, which kind of concerns me. And I don't know if there's enough emphasis getting placed on the root cause of some of those problems and that refinement, I think, would drive improvement. But at the same time, going back to the ISO, I don't know if that's the right use of load conformance. But anyway, I'll leave it to others to decide.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Good.
So, Stuart, this is Danny with the ISO. This is one of the reasons why in our RSC enhancement initiative, we are trying to do the consideration of load conformance in phase 2, because we think some of those drivers will be fixed by our nodal FRP, so our FRP refinements that is supposed to go in next year, as well as the day-ahead market enhancements imbalance reserve products. So we have identified that there may be better ways to get us that flexibility. So we are working to try to do those through other market enhancements and want to see how those work, and then maybe look at considering load conformance. Thanks.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Danny, but I don't want the revisions that we're looking at in RSE to become too onerous on the EIM entities that seem to have less of a problem, maybe the ISO. And maybe we should bifurcate and specifically, look at ISO and what it's doing, and is there better remedies there than, tweaking RSE or, wait until phase 2. I understand some of the improvements that are coming through that RSE, and they may indeed work, and it may be worth waiting for that and then revisiting. But I think we're looking at two totally different issues here when it comes to load conformance between CAISO and the EIM entities.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we do have one more caller with a question. Next caller is Todd Ryan. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. I really appreciate all this work and the availability of the data. I'm Todd Ryan with PG&E. I just had a question regarding some of these data. Given the really order of magnitude difference in size from some of our participants, I'm curious if it might be appropriate to present sometimes some of these metrics both in terms of megawatts, but also in terms of percentage of load or percentage of peak load, given that 100 megawatts of conformance or shortfall on a test might be very different between one participant and another. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Yeah, we can look at doing that. One of the reasons we didn't, and I thought about it, was because there was some interest in some of the systematic, persistent actions. And if you, for example, for the ISO, if you did it as a percent of the load forecast, we have the highest load imbalance performance adjustments in those peak load hours. So some of that kind of persistent patterns can be hidden a little bit when you do a percent of load. But I agree, it does help to kind of put each of the areas on the same playing field.
Yeah, I agree that.
Just to add to that,
sorry.
We've been reporting on imbalance conformance across the EIM regularly in our quarterly reports. It's actually a FERC requirement, and the standard reporting that we do both gives sort of an average megawatt quantity as well as scaling that as a percent of the load at the time. Those are typically in Chapter 2.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I was speaking more generally about all these metrics, just that, I think the megawatt absolute value is important to understand from a reliability perspective, but it also, in terms of equity, could skew or could make one, it'd be helpful to see it from both perspectives, just to understand the data better. Thank you.
Okay, that's helpful. We could also look at, we're talking about releasing some of this data, interval level data. We could look at also adding the load forecast to the data so that different participants can do that perspective as well. All right, is there anything else, or can we move on?
I think
like
we can
there's
move
no
on.
hands up. All right. So this last set of metrics is really to share more granular type metrics we can produce. So this would cover either a day or a handful of hours. The metrics that I'm showing here are covering the ISO on July 9th, which was the date which hit the stage 2 energy emergency. So that said, we're looking for input from stakeholders on either thresholds we could use to produce similar kind of period-specific charts for any area, or additional metrics to include in this section. So with that, here's the first one. It's showing EIM imports coming into the ISO during peak load hours on July 9th. The red and green lines show the intervals in which the ISO failed the sufficiency or capacity test. And then you can also see the import limit that is enforced after failing those tests. So you can see like the import limit that's enforced is going to be set for the ISO based off the last 15-minute market transfer. And then you can see by 15-minute and 5-minute market by the light and the dark blue bars. The next set of slides is looking at kind of breaking down the capacity and sufficiency test by different components. So first, we're looking at the bid range capacity test. The two lines show the requirement, both with and without that new uncertainty component. The total height of the bars shows the capacity that was used to meet capacity test requirements. And then just for informational purposes, it's not a test component. The dark green bars reflects the portion of generation capacity that was available for the bid range capacity test, but was not available for the flexible ramping sufficiency test. So just a reminder that the flex ramp sufficiency test considers all resource intertemporal constraints. So this would be like ramp rates, startup times, transition times. The capacity test does not. If we move to the next slide, it's the same as the last one, except for we're splitting up that generation, that bid range capacity by different resource and field types. So you can see, like in the intervals in which the ISO failed the capacity test on this day, which was hour ending 19, intervals 3 and 4, where the requirements were at and where the bid range capacity was at used to meet those requirements. And then the last two is going to the flexible ramping sufficiency test. So here we're showing the different components of the requirement by the bars. So the requirement is calculated as the change in load plus uncertainty minus these two discounts, diversity benefit and flexible ramping credits. The upward credits are net EIM exports for the upward test. So for July 9th, the ISO was importing on net during this whole period, so there's not going to be any credits shown here. And then you can see where that requirement is and how that compares against the ramp capacity that was available, which is the dotted line. And then if we kind of swap that and show, this is looking at the flexible ramping sufficiency test ramping capacity. So the bars are showing now the the different resource and fuel types that made up the ramp capacity for the test and how that compares against the requirement. So here, the ramping capacity used in the flexible ramping sufficiency test, that can come from both fixed changes in schedules or renewable forecasts, as well as economic bid-in capacity up considering kind of resource intertemporal constraints. So that's the end of the kind of the period-specific metrics. I'm curious if there's any comments or questions at this time on maybe ways to improve this section.
Looks like we do have a question. Please go ahead.
Hey, yeah, Dan Williamson, Customized Energy Solutions again. So going back to, I think it was slide 29. Yeah, that one. So is the takeaway that we should be sort of grasping here is that if the CAISO had implemented some of the changes being considered in the current RSC initiative around intertemporal constraints in the bid range capacity test, that there would have been more intervals of test failures, you know, a few there in hours ending 18, a couple more in 21. Is that correct?
So not entirely. The changes being proposed under the RSC Enhancements Initiative don't entirely align with this resource constraint capacity. I think the main difference is that when we're looking at this resource constraint capacity, we're looking at like all intertemporal constraints, ramp rates, and from a capacity test perspective, we don't necessarily want to exclude that capacity to the extent that it was bid in and made available to the market. It just might not have been available in that interval because of the optimization and previous dispatch decisions.
So that's kind of going to the discussion being had in that initiative about
exactly
how far to look forward out of stuck versus RTUC, that sort of thing.
Right. So I would characterize that dark green bar as potentially one extreme where we're considering all resource constraints, and it would be a subset of that that's up for discussion, potentially to the extent that it's committable in the short-term unit commitment process or something else.
Okay, and then kind of maybe a bit of a left field question, but just the steepness and change in the requirement between the way that our ending 19, the requirements, you know, scaling up pretty steeply towards the end of the hour, and then, you know, dropping so significantly to restart for hour ending 20. Is that just a function of how the demand was shaping during that period, the steepness of the ramp headed into the net peak, and maybe some changes in interchange, or
so I haven't looked at that hours specifically, but my sense is that it's driven by the intertie schedules. So for the capacity test, the requirement is set by, it's like the imbalance requirement. You take your load forecast plus your export schedules, and then you subtract out the import and generation schedules. So in this case, I believe it's more so the changes in the import and export base schedules, which were driving the changes in the requirement for hour ending 20.
Okay, and that then map it back to the earlier discussion on imbalance conformance. Having steeper imbalance conformance in the HASP then could be drawing in significantly more intertie imports during those times. That could be part of that equation, I guess, as well.
Yeah, so the base schedules that are used in the requirement are based off of, for the ISO, advisory intervals from the last 15-minute market interval right prior to the test. So to the extent that those advisory intervals included more import or exports then prior to the hour because of imbalance conformance activity, that would flow through.
And I guess kind of just to wrap it up there then is just kind of in the future maybe to get DMM's opinion, or maybe this is more a question for the CAISO community as well, just how, and I think you brought this up maybe in some of the comments that DMM submitted, but just sort of how beneficial it is to the market to have tests that have that level of variability and or accuracy in them, with having a target that's moving like that, how beneficial that is to the overall goals of the sufficiency evaluation.
Sure, and I think we made one comment in our last round that looked at potentially looking at the tests rather than this incremental approach, potentially going to a total approach that might be more understandable and be able to see exactly where those changes are. But we could take a look at that. All right, and with that, I think go into the kind of the metrics and development. So the metric I'm showing here is actually not in the report that was released last Friday. We decided to post it just to get some feedback because of the interest surrounding this metric. It's a comparison of unloaded capacity and EIM transfers. So there's still some internal discussions on how we want to measure unloaded capacity. What I'm showing here is maybe two options, two different perspectives to look at it. You could look at it from a kind of a total unloaded capacity perspective, which is similar to what's already being done in the bid range capacity test. You have your generation base schedules, which is at your loaded capacity, and then the capacity test is everything incremental above that, not considering any kind of ramp constraints or intertemporal constraints. The other perspective, which is shown by the red bars, would be if we're looking at unloaded capacity, considering ramp constraints and everything else. So this is almost like a flexible ramping sufficiency test perspective, which you can see here is quite a bit lower. And then besides that, for the comparison, just net EIM imports at the same time for each of those test intervals, and then being able to highlight the periods in which we're also seeing the RSC failure. So I'm curious to hear if there's any suggestions on this metric, or maybe we do neither the capacity or sufficiency test approach that I'm showing here.
There is a question in the queue.
Sure, let's go to that.
Your line's unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yes, good morning. It's Mark Simons of the Bonneville Power Administration. Two questions, actually, but I think they're kind of similar, or I'd like you to tell me if I'm going off in the wrong direction here. So first and foremost, thank you for including this unloaded capacity graphic. I think it's very instructive. It's something that we've asked for you, or at least ISO in our comment, to put together. And so really appreciate seeing that here in this deck. Now to the question, the two choices of unloaded capacity, are these the same basic, are the distinctions the same as the distinctions between the green and the dark green on slide 29? Meaning they're utilizing the same difference in
exactly. Exactly. I'm looking at,
okay.
I'm leaning on the flexible ramping sufficiency test in order to derive what is the maximum available considering intertemporal constraints, which was the same approach.
Okay, and with that being true, then I think the thing that would be really helpful, and this gets at the difference in roles here, because you guys are kind of reporting after the fact, but yet we're talking about material that is pending in a current policy initiative. It'd be really helpful to understand where in this upper blue bar the ISO or the current proposal stands. I suspect it's near the top, but any feedback that you all have on that would be interesting. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Actually, that takes me to the next slide. On additional metrics and development, we are looking to kind of model and do some kind of counterfactual analysis of the changes proposed under the ROC Enhancements Initiative. So this would include the consideration of the short-term unit commitment capacity and how that's considered available. And we're looking at maybe doing some other sensitivities surrounding there. That isn't developed yet, but we are looking at doing so. And then the next one, also looking at the power balance constraint and feasibility, and including that in the flexible ramping sufficiency test, just as was in the proposal. And then the other two kind of we're looking at doing in the near future are the VER and load forecast comparisons to actuals, and also wrapping that up with the uncertainty values used in the test.
Those additional metrics would be fantastic. So thank you for highlighting these again.
All right, that's the end of the additional metrics section. I don't know if there's any questions at this time. Also, if there's suggestions after the fact, I will leave an email address at the end for other kind of comments or metric suggestions. All right, and with that, just a quick discussion on interval level data. Like Eric said, we're planning to release interval level data in CSV files underlying the charts in the report. We're looking at starting with the test outcomes and each of the components in the flex ramp sufficiency and bid range capacity test, and then we would expand from there. That said, we're open to any questions or concerns with posting these files online. And then also on a longer term perspective, we're looking at other avenues to get this interval level data out there and publicly. So this might be maybe a view on CAISO's today's outlook or OASIS or something similar.
Reiterate a little bit what Kyle just mentioned about the interval level data. The idea there is to post online for all areas and all intervals the same level of detail that that he just had up on the screen for a single area in a particular time interval, so that would be available for any analysis that market participants wish to do. We really hope to hear today if there are any concerns about posting that data. I'd love to hear about those, or any desire to see that data.
Yeah, and I'll add on that one, you know, we're glad to get input today, but, you know, ultimately we're going to defer to the ISO in making that call. But certainly, you know, the concerns, you know, the ISO will be able to see those as well and consider those. So.
So that's the end today. Again, you can send comments or questions to this address, dmm@caiso.com. And if there's any kind of final questions or suggestions, I do like to think of this first report as almost like a growing document. So we're happy to make changes from here on out. Looks like we have a question, a hand raised.
Do you have a question? Call, you're unmuted.
Yeah,
please go
Mark
ahead.
Simons. Hi, it's Mark Simons again at Bonneville. So comments and questions just go into the email address. Is that the complete process, or is there any way to kind of socialize what everybody's feedback is that you all are considering, maybe more than just emails being received?
So, Mark, this is Danny. I had planned with the next iteration of the policy proposal to cite this new report that the DMM is putting out, and then also providing a framework to submit comments there as well.
Okay,
this is also the first of a set of monthly reports. So as we make changes in the metrics that we're reporting or add things, I think we can summarize that in the published reports as well.
And I might have been on a touch late, so I apologize. But as I recall, there's like two different organizations within the DMM. I think both of the managers are on here, if I remember correctly. Which organization is really the one, if we wanted to have some feedback or follow-on discussion, that we would pursue further, or just reach out to Eric directly?
Yeah, you can just reach out to me because actually, yeah, a lot of these issues, they cut across. You know, Amelia's group does do more of the reporting and the ongoing monitoring, but Ryan's group has the lead in the policy going forward. So we really work as a group. So yeah, if you do send it to this address, if you want to CC, you know, if you have our emails, Ryan, myself, and Amelia, we will look at it as a group.
Perfect. Thank you all. And again, really appreciate you guys taking on this additional role. I think it's really valuable for the transparency and accuracy going forward.
All right, well, I want to thank everyone for the time today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Michelle. I think we can wrap up here.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending this presentation, and thank you for using Event Services. Your conference has ended, and you may disconnect.